Okay, time for my report for late June. Fishing out of Niantic. Finally got rid of that easterly wind. It's been killing us for the last week or two. Met up with a couple of guys from CT Fish Talk, Steve, and we started out about 3 o'clock in the morning. As you can see, it was a beautiful morning, but not much happening in the Harkness area. Shot on over to Fisher's Island. Got my first striper, fishing a little swim bait. Pitching it up into some boulders and smacked it pretty hard right on the first cast. That little teaser there in front of it you can see floating around. This guy wasn't exactly a monster, but you know, getting that first fish in the boat's always nice. Basically fishing the last couple hours, last hour and a half or so of the ebb tide. Did most of my fishing this day on tube and worm. Talk a little bit about that. You can see I'm fishing a pretty light setup. Little Cabo conventional reel on a 7-foot medium heavy rod. Like I said, drag a lot of tube and worm in here this time of year and into July and August. You know, caught that first one on the little swim bait. Caught a couple of schoolies on small hoagies, but you know, basically it was a tube and worm that was the go-to today that they were hitting on. If you haven't fished tube and worm before in a small boat or a kayak, it's pretty simple. I make all my tube rigs, but you can also get them at any of the sporting goods stores. You know, the ones I fish are about 18 to 20 inches long, and I brought out a couple of boxes of sandworms, but the schoolies were banging them up pretty bad, so I switched over to a gulp, and the gulp worm was working just as well as the sandworms and was holding up a little bit better to the short strikes. I've got this thing spooled up with either 17 or 20 pound Power Pro metered braid, which for these size fish is plenty. You know, this isn't the setup I would use to fish bigger fish further out, but you know, when you're fishing largely these smaller schoolies or keepers that are in the low 30-inch range, this is more than enough. Makes it a lot more fun than hauling them in on basically a block and tackle. You know, a broomstick with a winch attached to it. I think this was probably the second keeper I had of the day, or one that was close to it. Wasn't really keeping any fish, so basically pulled them out, took a look at them, put them right back on into the water. Now, if you haven't trolled tube and worm before, it's a great tactic for small boats or kayaks fishing along the shoreline. I generally target about 10 to 12 feet of water, you know, right along any areas that are, you know, have rocky shorelines, but you know, sometimes along Goshen Beach as well. If they're kind of moving from one point to another, you'll catch them in there. But like I said, 10 to 12 feet of water, sometimes a little shallower depending on the conditions, and you want to troll it about as slow as you can. And I've got a little 20 horsepower outboard on here, and I put it down in the lowest forward speed, idling forward speed it'll go, and troll right along the beach. I'll make a run, and then, you know, once I hit the end of like a little crescent area or a point, I'll loop back around, try to loop around far enough outside that you're not going to spook any of the fish that you're going to be trolling back over. You know, reset my lines and off I go. Another little fish here. You know, like I said, my preferred method is casting, light tackle, spinning gear, but you know, you got to go with what's working. You know, this day I wasn't seeing any little schools of bait. You know, wasn't seeing any birds circling or flying around, so if I was casting, it was pretty much blind casting into, boulder fields, points. Whereas the tube and worm, I can basically cover quite a bit of ground and pick up those fish that are hanging around in singles or small numbers. In some ways it's not quite as fun or as exciting as the light tackle casting, particularly fishing the surface hoagies and watching them go explode on the top water. And you get that initial explosion and the rod doubled over, and the hookup is certainly a lot of fun, a rush. Don't quite get that trolling the tube and worm. A lot of times when I get the hit, the first thing I do is I'm not even disengaging the motor. I'm letting it run and keeping moving forward. The hook's basically set itself, and as long as the fish is tight, I've left the rod in the rod holder because I got to bring in other lines before I start to fight the fish. So, quite often that first run is used up while the rod's in the rod holder, and I get the other line or two in, and by the time I've done that, the fish has already made one good run and taken most of the sting out of it. Another reason why it's not my favorite, but I like catching fish more than not catching fish. Not a bad little fish. Fishing the light tackle, fishing these areas, I'm not likely to hook up with 40, 50 pounders. And if I do hook a bigger fish, it's definitely a challenge to get it in. You might lose some of the bigger ones, but it does make the fight a lot more fun when you're catching either schoolie size or smaller keepers. You'll notice even some of these smaller keepers will still spin my boat around a little bit as I, play with them. Watched a guy the other year bring in a 40-plus pounder in his kayak. That thing took him for a ride. Took him from Harkness almost all the way down to the other end of Goshen Beach. This fish felt like it was 20, 25 pounds. Spun me all over the place. I get him up to the boat, find out he's barely a keeper. He's just hauling about 20 pounds worth of seaweed and other kinds of crap all wrapped up around the line. Yeah, he also tries to tail slap me in the face. Turns out it definitely wasn't the fish I thought it was. Well, like I said, the wind shifted around to a southwest wind, which was nice for the way out and the outgoing tide, but I knew I was going to take a beating coming back in, and yeah, that was definitely the case, but small price to pay for some good fishing. Yeah, looking forward to doing a little bit more fishing this week, going out on a night trip on the Black Hawk, and probably be fishing the little Jimma Rose again next weekend.